Hello, we're going to be looking at Chapter 19, which is Stalemate to Crisis. This is going to be focusing on the politics, the economy of the Gilded Age. We are going to be looking basically from the 1870s through 1900, and we're going to really be focusing on this whole aspect of Republican-Democrat stalemate that was going on politically, where each party was sort of hold into their representatives and their main ideology, and really not really getting much done for the massive amount of change that was going on in America during this Gilded Age time period. So let's get right started quickly. In this time period, we had a wave of very passive presidents, basically from Ruther B. Hayes in the election of 1876 all the way through Benjamin Harrison, and then eventually the election of McKinley. McKinley will sort of be at the very tail end of this, with his running mate eventually ending this passive presidency. His running mate would basically be Theodore Roosevelt. So when McKinley did pass away and get assassinated in 1901, we do see the end of this passive presidency with the ascension of Theodore Roosevelt and the start of the Progressive Era. So one of the reasons for this passive presidency was the major split that was going on electorally wise. We had the Democrats and the Republicans extremely evenly split. One big reason for this was that basically the Redeemers in the Solid South had basically overtaken the Republican rule down there, and so really reinvented the Democratic Party to be a hold-in and a very strong area to rule the South. The Republicans had a coalition of people from the North and the West, and they had a very good, sort of grouping there. So very evenly split population-wise when it comes to each side. Also, we are seeing the Republican presidencies and the parties backing away from Southern support of African American policies with the sort of the ending of the Reconstruction. And we see both sides really not focusing on major change. Both sides being very laissez-faire. Both sides really sort of playing into the Gilded Age politics. The really big issue for both parties was going to be their economic policy, especially focusing on protective tariff. Another trend this time period, we had extremely high voting turnout, about 78% of the male populace. Again, that's extremely high, especially when you factor in that most African Americans were not voting in this time period, not because they couldn't vote, but because of disenfranchisement, poll taxes, literacy tests, constitution tests, and just an overall intimidation in the South. These presidents are going to be Ruther B. Hayes, James Garfield, Chester Arthur, Cleveland, Harrison, and then we'll get Cleveland again. And like I said, this time period was really focused on this laissez-faire ideology of government is going to be very hands-off the economy and society. This laissez-faire policy was the belief that basically the less the government did, the better. And some of the reasons for this party loyalty, one big was obviously regional differences. We had the Democrats overtake the South again, and so that was the big part there. You had the Republicans dominate the North, but you also had this influx of immigrants into the North that also started to side with the Democrats. So that sort of offset the lack of population in the South with this new wave of Democrats in the North. Also, we see Northern nativists, Protestants typically start side with the Republicans. And we're going to see the map. We see very strong holdout of Republicans in the North. Obviously, we have the Solid South. Pretty much they'll all be voting all Democrat every single time. And the West is going to be sort of flip-flopping between Republican and Democrat out there. Also, you see in the 1892 election, we will see a third party rise up, with the Populist Party gaining foothold with this western rural area and farmer areas. Okay, one of the only real big things that the Republican government did in regards to civil service, or basically civil welfare, helping making changes for the betterment of the people, was the Civil War pension system, which was created to basically give Civil War veterans a old age retirement pension. very popular. One of the few things that was done for supporting the populace. In the Republican Party, you did have these two different groups called stalwarts and half-breeds. These are, again, just names that we put onto the Republican Party, and some of the things that are going on. One thing is that there's a lot of corruption in the Republican Party. And we see two groups of party hacks, party groupings. We see the stalwarts, who favored the traditional political machines, who favored basically keeping the Republican rule in power and in a position to benefit from the government positions. You see the half-breeds, who were Republicans, who wanted to change some of this, who wanted to actually maybe push some reform, especially within the civil service and government patronage, corruption, and so much. So, but these are groups of Republicans who were Republicans, stalwarts, wanted to keep a system alive that they had, the corruption and their sort of cronyism, you could say. You had the half-breeds who still wanted to remain Republicans, but favored change and reform. So we're going after Hayes, we're going to see the election of James Garfield, who was a half-breed. He promised to support reform. He promised to support some change, some governmental change if he won the presidency, and he did. And he promised to basically not just be so party line patronage, that basically he's going to try to reform the way we hand out government jobs within the civil service sector. His running mate will actually be someone very opposite to him, basically a very sort of stalwart of a Republican, Chester Arthur, who was embedded into the corruption of the New York political machine up there. And there's some of their campaign slogans. Early on in Garfield's presidency, he will be shot by a individual who thought he was slighted by not getting a government appointment. He was shot on a train platform, and basically he will be alive for several months. He was shot 4 months after an election, and he will be alive for another 4 or 5 months. Most likely, the reason why he died was not because of the gunshot wound, was because of the doctors constantly using bad sanitation techniques and probably causing Garfield to have a worse infection, causing him to pass away. So really nothing that on Garfield's agenda was accomplished. So Arthur's going to come in, and one thing that Arthur will actually do, he will actually then set up and actually have some government reform. He's going to push through Congress the Pendleton Act of 1883. This act is going to require some government jobs to be filled by examination basis. So instead of just giving the job to anyone you want, that you have to have some qualifications through examination process. So this is going to clean up some of the patronage that was going on in this Gilded Age. The next election, we're going to see basically Arthur not run, but we're going to see basically the Republicans elect some guy named Blaine. And he will run against a Democrat who is from the North, basically Grover Cleveland. He will win by only 23,000 popular votes, and he promised to be a reformist. He promised to be crack down on the political machines. He was against the protective tariffs, so that obviously favored the South and their economic ideology. And you see that he won solidly the South, and really what allowed him electorally to win is this swing state, New York. And so that was going to be this big state that will be flip-flopped, if you see, which Garfield won it in 80, and then you see 84, Cleveland will win New York. So that's going to be one of those swing states that flip-flops back and forth in these elections in many cases. And the supporters of Cleveland were called mugwumps. These are people that had left the Republican Party to basically side with the reformist of Cleveland, who promised to bring in government reform. And one thing he did do, he did bring in a secret ballot, which will allow for more secrecy when it comes to your casting your ballot. Basically, it's called the Australian ballot. Basically, it's where the there's no name or there's no identification on the ballot, so therefore the party officials can never recognize who will cast the ballot, giving more security behind your vote. You see here, this is a campaign which is pretty much favoring the each side. You see free trade for Cleveland, protection for Harrison, and this is basically a magazine article that really is favoring neither side. Both of them, obviously it's favoring the next. It's obviously favoring. Now look at it a little closer. Actually favoring Harrison. I was going to think, no, it's not favoring either side. It's not unbiased. But when I look at it, it's obviously favoring Harrison. But you see basically society on each one. You see this one, the factories are not going. You see the factories all stopped. You see, the family, obviously out of work. And here you see the factories running. You see Uncle Sam and the business owner working together. You see, the babies and the family, doing well. And again, obviously this is favoring Harrison over Cleveland in its ideology. Okay, and in this election, we see Harrison win. So we see Cleveland run for a re-election, and he will lose this election. So this is one of these weird elections in '88 where Harrison will win the electoral vote but lose the popular vote. You see here, you see Cleveland will actually get more of the popular vote right there than Harrison does. But he does lose the electoral vote. Again, if you look closely, the main reason why is that New York, that one state, will flip to Harrison over Cleveland. So basically, if you take New York and you take it off of Harrison, you put it into Cleveland, Cleveland will win this election. So New York, again, is one of these swing states, these flip states. It goes back and forth. Okay. In this election, we're going to have the same two candidates. So again, we're going to have another runoff between Harrison and Cleveland. And you see this time Harrison will lose. One of the things that does take away some of Harrison's votes is these popular votes in the West. So if you think about where Harrison was, so you see, let's look at these states of Colorado, Kansas, and Nevada, because Idaho was not a state yet. And they went for Harrison. If you look at Kansas, Colorado, Nevada, they were blue, and they were in the Republican side in this election before. You see 4 years later, Nevada, Colorado, Kansas all swing populist. So this populist party, which we're going to talk about in this lecture, does have an impact on this election. Even though they don't actually win any presidency, they do help sway the presidency to a different party. And you see again, New York is that swing state. Again, it will swing itself again to Cleveland this time, giving him the victory. Okay, politics and the people. We already sort of went through this in the last lecture, so I'm going to go through this really quickly again, though. We also obviously we see political machines were a big part of party politics, especially on the city level, especially strong in the large cities of New York and Chicago. We see these party politicians promising either jobs or apartments or dwellings or protections to immigrants, basically in lieu of maybe getting a vote from them. They are wanting to be in because they want to get government jobs, to have graft, to have some type of sort of footing to then get money from the government position that they're in. And like I said, they're going to prey on immigrants. They're going to basically prey on these immigrant poor. They want their vote. Probably the most famous one is the Tammany Hall boss, Boss Tweed. Eventually he'll go to prison for corruption. We're going to see some cartoons here like we saw from last time. Obviously, eventually the secret ballot is going to get rid of this, this ballot watching. Again, eventually he'll be cracked down, these vultures, and the government's going to sort of clean up this government mess that they had. Okay, some new public issues. Again, we are going to see some reform of laws to be put into place to clean up some of the corruption going on within the monopolies. The problem is that these laws are going to have very little effect because we're going to see these laws not being enforced. For example, the Sherman Antitrust Act put into place in 1890 was basically to stop corporate monopolies that enacted interstate trade. However, though, the Congress is going to do very little to enforce this law. So it's going to have very little effect early on. Again, its whole point was to sort of take away power of these big political bosses in the Senate. But again, the control of this, the actual enforcement of this law is not going to be out. So we're going to see very little actual enforcement, so it's going to do very little good in this time period. What it actually does crack down on, which you should put notes in, is that it does crack down on unionization across state lines. And it's actually put a regulation on strikes and unionization. So you see here that the unions, basically, you have your labor, you have poverty, you have the one tool of strike, being very, very, very outmatched against these large monopolies that have the backing of the senators, the backing of the subsidized press. You see the backing of basically legislation in favor of them. Also, you're going to see an extremely high tariff put in place by the Republicans who control Congress. You see Congressman McKinley is going to be very much for a high tariff, and because of this and because of the election of the panic that's going to ensue, we're going to see many Republicans lose some congressional seats within the early 1890s. You're also going to see the Interstate Commerce Act, like we talked about a couple sections ago. We're going to see this act come in place and are going to be putting forward the Interstate Commerce Commission. These acts were set up because of the court case of Munn versus Illinois and Wabash versus Illinois. Munn versus Illinois was the court case that allowed Granger laws, the legality of them. Later on, though, we're going to see a reversal of that, where the Supreme Court's going to basically rule against that case in Wabash versus Illinois, saying that the regulation must come from the federal level and not the state level. So they're going to create the ICC. It will ban discrimination between long and short hauls, and it will require interstate rails rates to be reasonable. But again, very little effect, and it's not going to have much enforcement to actually bring down railroad shipping costs. And because that we are going to see agrarian revolt, like we talked about in earlier time periods, we're going to go over sort of quickly. We see the advent and rise of the Grangers, which is the combination of farmers and these co-operators. Eventually, we're going to see the Farmers Alliance, which we're going to see basically a political movement where they're going to start pushing states to pass laws in favor of them. The Granger laws are an example of Illinois. We're going to see them pushing women's rights. And Mary Lisa is going to be one of these advocates for the farmers and for rights of women in the West. And then we're also going to see the birth of a new political party, which is the Populists, or the People's Party. The roots of populism really has its roots in the rural areas and the farming areas of both the South and the West. And we're going to see a series of depressions who really hurt farmers that are going to push these farmers to finally sort of politicize and band together. We also see the increasing tariffs of the Republican Party are going to basically force many farmers and rural people to feel that they're being sort of taken advantage of by the politics. Because these tariffs, what they do, they actually put an increase on manufactured goods that they buy, but it doesn't actually help their farm goods at all. Also, we can see farmers being victimized by monopolizations of banks and railroads, and that's a big one because farmers have to get loans out by banks, and the banks are going to prey on farmers knowing that, giving them extremely high percentage rates, loan rates, interest rates. And railroads are natural monopolies, knowing the farmers must ship their crops to the east and that they have no other option besides the one railroad line. So they're going to basically prey on them by raising the shipping costs to absorbent levels, but they know that the farmers have to pay that because there's no other way to ship your goods out from the west to the east. And basically, the Democrats and Republicans both were not going to do anything to really solve these problems or address the problems of the farmers. So we're going to see this new political agenda come in. This populist agenda was going to be a really strong farmers' rights agenda. It's going to support workers and unions. It's actually going to be an anti-immigrant agenda as well, because the thought is more immigration is going to cause wages to lower. And it's also going to focus on helping and supporting African Americans in the South, which is going to be a problem because that may lose some voters as well. They also want to look at something called free silver, which is going to be a push to create a currency for our country that's based off the silver commodity rather than the gold commodity. We'll get more into that in a couple slides. And you see here that this one populist party is going to basically really wane in the West. They're going to gain large support in the West by winning parts of North Dakota, Idaho, Oregon, Nevada, Colorado, and Kansas. And they're actually getting a pretty decent percentage points, 9 percentage points of popular vote. Again, a very minor third party, but still enough to sway an election, enough to start having the two parties start to be concerned about this group of people. So that's a big thing, that this group of populists will sway the election that had gone to Harrison in the election before back to Cleveland. So we are going to see that in future elections, more political parties, basically the Democrats and Republicans, are going to start to be concerned about getting these votes. Then we're going to have a major panic. So we're going to have basically Cleveland get into office, and we're going to have a major panic right when he takes office. The Panic of 1893 is probably our biggest economic panic outside the Great Depression of the 1930s. We're going to see the collapse of the stock market. We're going to see bank failures across the board, especially in rural areas like the western farmer areas. We're going to see low crop prices and instability of farmers. We're going to see lots of farmer foreclosures, for example. We also are going to see the instability of the U.S. currency, so we're going to see large inflation amounts too. Again, the biggest thing is that we are running out of gold is a big thing, and then so therefore we can't produce more currency because we are limited to the currency based on how much gold we have in the treasury. And so we're going to see a huge rush on banks. We're going to see people not trust the banking system. So we're going to see runs on banks, taking money out of banks, causing banks to fail even more. Because of this depression, we're going to see a group of people called Coxey's Army, where we're going to see them basically make a march to Washington, D.C., basically wanting to force the government into more social welfare programs and less laissez-faire. So it's just showing you that the government at this time period was willing to really almost do nothing to help the people out there who were suffering from this depression, panic, and recession. And the big silver question, or the big currency question, was the gold commodity was low, as in our reserves were dwindling, and we had lots of silver. We had the Silver Purchase Act of 1890 that flooded America with silver, and we had more silver available. The question was, should we switch to a currency based on silver, or should we keep our currency based off the gold model before? And here's the thoughts. I'm going to explain this during class because it's very sort of difficult. The thought is if we switch to silver, we could then print more money because we have more silver in reserves. By printing more money, it actually caused a deflation of our currency, which would actually help the more poor classes. And there's a reason why, which again we'll all actually talk about on Tuesday during class, of why does the poor people and farmers and people that actually have debt wants a silver currency, and why the rich or the bankers and the people that own the stocks want a gold currency. It is all about the valuation of money and how much money you are in debt to somebody to, or the bank to. And again, we'll talk about it more in lecture because it is a sort of a difficult concept of that. And we are going to have a candidate who's now going to sort of look into this and then adopt this silver question to gain the masses of the populace, again, to gain the commoners' vote, because the thought of that is that connecting yourself to this silver currency is going to help the commoners out who don't have massive amounts of money. So the election of 1896, we're going to see the candidates being William McKinley for the Republicans and William Jennings Bryan for the Democrats. He will run a Democrat agenda with a populist party platform support. So a lot of the things that William Jennings Bryan does is going to be a populist-focused agenda. He's going to sort of be a Democrat, but sort of morph a lot of the populists into his party to sort of gain that Western Southern vote as well. When he was nominated for the Democratic ticket, he gave this very famous speech, his Cross of Gold speech. Here it is. Having behind us the producing masses of this nation and the world, supported by the commercial interest, the laboring interest, and the toilers everywhere, we will answer their demand for a gold standard by saying to them, you shall not press down upon the brows of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold. So he was going to be the silver candidate, where McKinley will be the gold candidate. We see here Bryan, basically he has a populist agenda, swallowing the Democratic Party. Again, it's not going to be labeled the populist, but he's going to be looked very like a populist when it comes to his agenda. And here's another couple of famous picture of basically you see Hannah, which was one of the Republican Party members. You see some of the Republican Party members, and there's a Republican Party. And the thought is that basically they're crucifying labor and the common man with this cross of gold. And you see there, you see the Picatch for the labor, there. And we see Bryan being this silver candidacy, basically saying that this cross of gold, this crown of thorns, is going to hurt American population. And we see here 16:1 was a ratio for 16 ounces of silver would equal 1 ounce of gold. And his platform, like I said, is very similar to the populist platform. You see free silver, regulation of railroads. He wanted to have a graduated income tax. He wanted to improve working conditions with 8-hour workday and lower the economic tariff across the board. In this election, it's going to be a close popular vote election. You see 47% to only 51%. McKinley will win, though, the majority of the electoral vote. Again, basically taking all the North and the West, where Bryan is going to take all the South and also these Mountain West farming states as well. And McKinley, with the Republican nomination and the presidency, will have some reforms. He will basically increase the protective tariff to the highest levels, which is not really a reform for the South, but again, is to help the business interests of the North. He also is going to basically sign the Currency Act, which basically will confirm the nation's commitment to the gold standard. This will actually work because at the same time, we have a major gold strike in both Montana and Alaska. And so basically we have an influx of new gold reserves, which will allow us to then print more money to basically have a inflation of our currency, which is going to allow the currency to level off and have more liquidity and more currency available to every single person. We'll get into that in class as well. Okay, that's the lecture. You guys have a great day. We'll talk to you guys later.